Hello, my name is Cheryl Bartlett, and I'm the president of Harvey Heritage. From time to time, we invite speakers to talk to us about aspects of the history of the Harvey rural community located in New Brunswick, Canada. On November 16th, 2023, we welcomed Evelyn Fidler, Assistant Director of Heritage Resources at King's Landing, a historical settlement located in this area, to talk about King's Landing and surrounding settlements. She has spent 35 years in the museum field, including 31 at King's Landing. Her first position was in a community museum in Nova Scotia. She has since volunteered at many small and community museums in New Brunswick. These include the Loyalist House, the School Days Museum, the New Brunswick Military History Museum, the Fredericton Region Museum, and the Keswick Ridge Historical Society. Her passion is for all things museum, but particularly volunteering at small and community museums. In her spare time, Evelyn enjoys reading, watching sports, attending her church, and coaching youth soccer and softball. We welcome Evelyn Fidler.
So thank you all for inviting me up this evening. Sorry we had to re-cancel from the last time. The winter snow came early and I didn't have my snow tires. And it turned out to be a really nasty night, so I think we made the right call then. And got my snow tires, I'm all good to go. So I'll get started on presentation again. Thanking you for inviting me. And as always, when I do a presentation, I do a land acknowledgement. And this land acknowledgement is the one that King's Landing uses. And it is King's Landing Corporation respectfully acknowledges the territory in which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Wolastoqey, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy peoples. We strive for respectful relationships with all the peoples of this province as we search for collective healing and true reconciliation and honor this beautiful land together. So my first slide is my title slide. The title of my presentation is kind of a long one, but it's Communities and Families in the Harvey Rural Community, as interpreted as King's Landing. And as everybody in the room knows, most people on Zoom, we became the Harvey Rural, it's not rural Harvey, it's Harvey Rural, right? Right. Harvey Rural Community, January 1st, 2023, along with a whole lot of other communities in the province. And King's Landing joined your lovely rural community because King's Landing is located in Prince William, which is now part of Harvey Rural Community. When we became rural entities, my life got really complicated because I was involved in 4 entities. I live in the Hanwell entity, volunteer a lot in the Keswick, which is the Central York, work in the Harvey Rural Community, and my permanent residence is in the Nackwick. So I really got messed up on January the 1st. Yeah, so that kind of spans a little bit of our history that we're interpreting at King's Landing. So this is what I wanted to talk to tonight, our approach at interpreting the communities and family in the whole rural community, and how we do it at King's Landing. Now, just a little brief overview of what we're going to be covering. First of all, we're going to talk about the early New Brunswick settlements and the ties to the river system, and how this is reflected in King's Landing's early history, and I'm talking about its corporate history. And then we have new immigrant settlements, and as you're all well aware, Harvey is one of them, as well as Stanley and Hanwell. And there are communities in the Harvey rural community that King's Landing interprets and has been interpreting since our beginning. And that's the communities of Prince William, Pokiok, Closborough, and Longs Creek. I'm sure most of you are also aware that the Harvey rural community border is almost directly where the Longs Creek Bridge is. On my side of the bridge, it's in Hanwell. The other side where King's Landing is approached is in the Harvey rural community. And then we'll talk a little bit about our material history collection, which is quite well representative with a lot of Harvey families and Harvey donors, like the Huron family, Carmichael family, the Messer family, the Craig family, and the Greed family, to name a few. And then conclusion. I brought some artifacts, physical artifacts with me, but I'm also got pictures of these artifacts for those that are joining us by Zoom, so you can see the actual photograph of what I have. And let's move on. All right. Sorry, one too many. I deal with the old stuff. This new stuff is something I'm not not too up on. There we go. So early settlement in primarily rural New Brunswick is all tied to the river. It's because it was the main source of transportation. The river provided the most fertile land, provided access to the many islands in the river. The growth of the economy was very much based on the river. And communities along the river are easier to defend because, of course, transportation. When people originally settled New Brunswick, primarily after the Loyalist migration, the surveyors mapped out lots leading up from the river. So everybody would have a river frontage, at least amongst the early years, the planters, Acadians, and the Loyalists, and their land allotments would stretch back from the river. And the slide we see here is an example of where the Loyalist, the early Loyalist settlers primarily settled along the St. John River in this area. And right where we are now, of course, in this part of Harvey is a little further away than the early settled properties and lands. But King's Landing sits on the branch for the King's American Regiment, which is kind of in the middle at the upper right, on the bottom, on the curve there. And then that's the reason why we're called King's Landing. It's because the land was originally settled by the King's American Regiment, and King's Landing, river system, landing. They all landed on the river. And most of the early settlers, of course, came up along the river to find their allotments. A lot didn't stay where they originally were supposed to receive their land grants for whatever reason. They wanted to move closer to other family. They didn't find the land fertile enough to support their families to make a living. So there's a lot of trading going back and forth in the early years, lots to lots, consolidating lots. Some preferred to open up businesses like sawmills and grist mills, so they wanted property that was that they could set up a sawmill on with good water system. So there's a lot of going back and forth. The surveyors were kept really busy surveying the properties. They couldn't settle until they actually had a surveyed land. And so then so that's where the Loyalists originally primarily settled. Now, we go back a little bit further to the planter and Acadian settlements, which were about 20, 30 years before the Loyalists, at least for the planter communities. And of course, Acadia was settled way back in the 1600s. The Acadians were around a long time. And again, as you see from the slide, that they also settled around the river system, because of the reasons I mentioned: transportation, fertile land, economy, easier to defend. So it stretches all throughout Nova Scotia. New Brunswick didn't become a colony till 1784, so that's why Nova Scotia is included in this map. And of course, the Acadians were settled 1755, and then the planters came. The planters primarily were from the United States. They came for economic reasons. They came to trade. In Nova Scotia, they came to fish. And they still consider themselves basically Americans just residing in the colony of Nova Scotia. And then even going back further, we have what's called the First Nations of New Brunswick. And as I said in my acknowledgement, it's the Wolastoqey, Mi'kmaq, and the Passamaquoddy. Where we are now is primarily the lands of the Wolastoqey. St. John, also known as the Brunswick River. And the First Nations too follow the river system for the same reason, mostly because transportation. Canoeing was easy most of the year, and in the winter times, of course, you can travel on the ice. So they're stretched either along the coast, which is a source of water transportation, or the St. John River systems. And King's Landing itself, our corporate history. Next year is our 50th anniversary. We started the idea of King's Landing way back in the 1960s, and we got our start also due to the river. The Mactaquac Dam was supposed to be built in the 1960s, and it was going to create a large head pond. And this large head pond was going to flood up from the Mactaquac Dam upriver. And a lot of the historic communities that had settled along the river were, of course, going to be underneath water. Some completely disappeared, and some lost all of their livelihood. A lot of the farmers had to move away. And so that when we started King's Landing, most of our interpretation was from the families that were affected by the head pond, because King's Landing was created sort of as a government project. It was approaching the bicentennial, and it was a way to provide employment for those that were displaced. So a lot of our buildings were salvaged from the head pond area. And so, of course, we go back, the river plays a key part in our own formation. Now, there are some exceptions. One is our family, the Colleens. And the Colleen cabin was located in the now the rural community of Hanwell. They were Irish, and they also represented later immigration to New Brunswick. Of course, when the Irish came, either pre-famine or post-famine, they were a lot of the prime land had been taken up, so they were given allotments further back in basically away from the big river system. They still tried to find smaller streams and things like that. The Colleen family immigrated to New Brunswick 1822, Timothy and Mary. And by 1842, the community was getting settled and became known as Hanwell. And in 42, they built a grist mill and a oak kiln. Now, the last owner of the Colleen cabin that we have at King's Landing, for those of you that have been to visit, was not in the Colleen family, it was in the Great Danish family. So they basically were cash poor. They couldn't go outright buy pine lots. They had to negotiate with the government to earn their lots. Now, I think I skipped again. I'll be doing that. Wait. Now we come to Harvey. why was Harvey settled? I guess most of you could answer that because you live in Harvey, so you probably know your own area really well. I think I skipped another slide. And this all goes back to why did people immigrate? Why did people come to New Brunswick? And they're called push and pull factors. Push and pull factors, some of the push factors are what are making you leave your country. For example, the Cleans leaving Ireland, many of the Harvey early families leave in Britain, the Welsh going to Cardigan, again, the Irish settled mostly around Stanley. And there's things that push you out of your country, mostly bad things, like war, poor economy, famine, unstable political climate, job loss due to mechanization. As farming mechanized, they need less and less physical help. A lot of people didn't own their land, they were tenant farming, and the expanding population. Those that even had land could only divide it so much amongst their family before it was able to be self-sustaining. Now, the pull factors are what draws you to a country. And they include a smaller population, the opposite of why you left. There's less people here. And cheap land. The New Brunswick government was encouraging immigration. Land was not expensive. Mostly they wanted you just to earn your land by farming it. Easy transportation to the place that you're going to settle. Again, river systems. An already established economy in New Brunswick that was things like fishing and lumbering. And also already having family here also was a big pull factor. And of course, we have those lovely land companies promising the moon for anybody that wants to come and settle. And as you will find out in Harvey, that didn't work out quite so well, and Stanley. Between 1834 and 1843, this is going back to the time when Harvey was first settled, between 6,000 and 8,000 new immigrants arrived in the province in those 9 years. Many of them came in what was called lumber ships. Lumber was being transported over to Europe, and so they didn't come back empty. You don't make money sending your ship back empty. They brought back immigrants. So lumber ships are bringing back lots of cheap immigrants that can only afford cheap fare. And by 1851, 20% of New Brunswick was born in Britain. And also, there was enticement to settle land without having to pay tithes and taxes. A lot of them were familiar with paying tithes because a lot of the places they came to, the local church, Anglican or Catholic, demanded a lot of tithing from them. Many also knew a lot about farming. And new immigrants, each head of the family had received 100 acres and 50 acres for each child, and the requirement to cultivate was really quite minimal. So we have Harvey, Stanley, and Hanwell. Now I mentioned that nice New Brunswick and Nova Scotia Land Company just a few minutes ago. It was established in the 19th century, even though it was misleading, it never operated in Nova Scotia. And they told the immigrants that once they settled here, they would build the infrastructure, the roads, the homes, the mills, and then resell the land to the settlers, of course, at a profit to themselves. They purchased 589 acres, all in York County, and that was from the time it was incorporated in 1834. But a lot of the land they purchased was inferior. That's why they got it so cheap. That's why they were hoping to turn out a good profit. And eventually, a lot of people that came here because of the New Brunswick and Nova Scotia Land Company turned to lumbering. And once they got here, of course, a lot of the promises were never fulfilled. And we all know the tragic story of Scotch settlement, the early Scottish settlement, where many of them died from sickness in their first winter. But this company remained active to 1890, so it's around a long time. Yeah. Here we have Stanley. And as I said, Stanley was also a planned community on the Nashwauk, and it was named after Colonel Secretary Lord Stanley. The first settlers that the land company sent over were juveniles, basically teenagers from London. Now, you can imagine their knowledge of surviving in the wilds of New Brunswick is very minimal. And yeah, that didn't turn out too well. So, and in 1836, they tried it again. They promised land to farm laborers and tradesmen. And many of these promises became unfulfilled. The third group were 45 Gaelic-speaking families from the Western Islands of Scotland, and they were primarily fishermen, and here they are settling in York County, New Brunswick. And of course, they were very unsuited to farming. A lot of them died the first winter, and then after that, they moved into the starting to be established town of Stanley. So they took the grievances against the company, and they eventually were resolved. It took a while. And well, as I mentioned earlier with the Colleens, Hanwell was a bit more successful. On your bottom right there is Thomas Bailey, and he was the Commissioner of Crown Lands and Forests and Surveyor General of New Brunswick, so quite an important man. In 1825, he petitioned for 700 acres in what was called the parish of Kingsclear, which he named Hanwell. And he brought over some Irish families to help settle it. And he also advocated for the construction of what was going to be called the Hanwell Road. And Britain was releasing a lot of its crown land, so Bailey took advantage of that, bought a lot of crown land, and brought other immigrants over, mostly from Ireland, until about 1846. So in 1866, we had 52 families that were living in Hanwell, and by 1871, there was over 300 settlers. So this immigrant community was largely successful. All right. So we all know the story of Harvey. I skipped over it, but we all know that a lot of the facts. So I know you'll correct me if I'm wrong. I know the story of Harvey. I've started studying it quite a few years ago. It was really fascinating. But in 1837, Ship Cornelius arrived in St. John with settlers from the Northumberland, Scotland, and they sent glowing reports back about communities, and they didn't mention anything about grievances and unfulfilled promises. And of course, they were sponsored by the New Brunswick Land Company. They landed in St. John, made their way up to Fredericton. And at that time, there was a stop put on the company's activities until the arrival of a new commissioner, which was Captain Richard Haynes. And but of course, like Stanley, were very much misinformed about the actual conditions in the province. So they asked the government to sell them land outside the territories that's owned by the company. The legislature agreed, and located them along a road that was being built between Fredericton and St. Andrews in the parish of Manor Sutton. They were taught how to fell the trees and given work on the road to help pay for the land. And in total, 254 lots were laid out on the road, and 24 heads of families grew for the lots. And Harvey was successful within just a few short years. Land was being cleared, crops were being harvested. And by 1845, there were 45 families in Harvey. And in 1850, Tweedside became its own neighboring settlement. Now, who do we focus on at King's Landing as part of the Harvey rural community? We focus on communities of Prince William, Dumfries, my slide, Longs Creek, but why not Harvey? It's because we originally were focusing on the areas that were being flooded along the river. So Harvey wasn't touched. Harvey was not flooded. And just a little bit about those communities. We community of Rosborough, which is also part of the Harvey rural community. We're represented at King's Landing by the Rosborough Barn, who was built for John Scott of Dumfries between 1840 and 1879. And then Charles Rosborough purchased the barn in 1915, and it was moved to King's Landing at the time we were creating the settlement, and 3 or 4 pieces joined back together. Now, we focus on the community of Pokiok because we now have the Lower Pokiok Superior School, and it was located at the Pokiok Settlement Road. And it was moved to King's Landing a little bit later, and it landed in its location it is now by the 1980s. First, it was an exhibit building, it was a gift shop, and in 2021, we decided to turn it into its original function, which was the Superior School, and we named it the Lower Pokiok Superior School from where it came. And the name Pokiok is a Bolstonian word that means a narrow place. And it was built shortly after 1861. Longs Creek. Pictures here. These are some of our buildings from Prince William, the Stone House, the Jones House. We have Riverside Presbyterian Church. We also have a little 4-seated privy, which came from the Saunders estate, the barony. Just got refurbished, looks really nice. 4-seater. 4-seater, yes, yeah, it's quite cozy in there. It's actually nice and plastered and everything, and then we have the Barony School, which is now some washrooms, and the Jocelyn Farm. Nice big Jocelyn Farm. Rosborough, Pokiok, we have the Rosborough Barn and the Lower Pokiok School. Longs Creek, of course, we have the Long family home, which was moved by the river transportation system to King's Landing, because by the time we went to acquire it, the bridge was in place. We couldn't get it across the bridge, so we had to float it up. Which it was quite a feat. It took a while for them to decide that they were going to move it to King's Landing because it was in the area that's now Woollastic Park, and they had different. They were going to use it as the park ranger's house. They had different purposes. Finally, they released it to King's Landing. We floated it upriver along with its barn. The barn was on a barge that unfortunately lost its tow, started to go back downriver. That was conveniently hidden in some correspondence, but we got her back. And Longs Creek, of course, is named after Abraham Longs Sr. As we grew as King's Landing, we expanded our interpretation to include other areas and other collections. What we actually collect at King's Landing is objects produced in New Brunswick, which illustrate regional and cultural variations within the province. Objects used in New Brunswick, but made elsewhere. Objects not made or used in New Brunswick, but related to New Brunswick material, collected for specific study, exhibition, education, or documents or records created or owned by a New Brunswick individual, family, institution, organization, or business, and objects produced elsewhere which document cultural influences which would have been transferred to New Brunswick. Now, this is where Harvey starts to come into the picture at King's Landing. Because our collection is broader than the buildings that were part of the original King's Landing historical settlement, we now start to collect family history and family collections from other areas nearby, and definitely from people in Harvey. And we have some quite significant objects from these families, and I've brought some with me. First collection came from Philip Huron, who I actually had the privilege to meet. Now, Philip was born in 1933, and he was the son of John Douglas, who lived from 1911 to 1967, and Sarah Lillian, who lived from 1911 to 1936. And he possibly had a sister, Louise Lillian Melrose Huron, who was born in November 1936, but died in December 1936. So he was raised by his grandparents because his mother died early, 1936. And he married Barbara Weatherby, and they had one daughter, Mindy. And he passed away in April 23rd, 2010 in Oak Bay. Now, Philip's connection to Harvey is because he's a descendant of the Wilson family. He donated a lot of postcards to us as a collection, which are now housed in the Provincial Archives. And a lot of them involved Sarah, who was the daughter of Albert Johnson and Nellie B. Wilson. So here we have the Wilson family represented. Nellie lived from 1881 to 1964. And she was the daughter of Alexander Wilson, who came as one of the early settlers, original settlers, 1834, who died in 1906. And Isabel Bell Wilson, Bell was her maiden name, and she lived from 1845 to 1931. Now, Alexander Wilson was a storekeeper and a carpenter who made caskets, and he was also a farmer. So he is a man of some means because he has a side business beside farming. So here we have some daguerreotypes that were donated by Philip, along with a lot of other nice things. And brought them with me. People in the audience can take a look at afterwards. They're really quite lovely. And here we have Alexander and Isabel. Alexander and Isabel. Now, this is what we call a daguerreotype. The daguerreotype is quite an early photographic process, one of the earliest actually. And each image is captured on a copper plate, invented, of course, by Louis-Jacques Monde Daguerre. And they're popular from 1839 to the early 1860s. So these daguerreotypes of the Wilson date from at least before the 1860s. There's only one known daguerreotype photographer that I was able to find based on the research of Josh Green at the Provincial Archives, and it was Frederick Wise Sr., who was practicing in Fredericton in 1845. So it's possible that the Wilsons could have had their picture taken in Fredericton, or daguerreotype taken in Fredericton, and even by Wise himself. And they're just quite lovely. We have some daguerreotypes in our collection, but these are one of the clearest. Now our next family is came from the donor Katie. Get her name straight. Katie Isabel Carmichael, and she was the daughter of James Carmichael, who lived in 1834 to 1904, and Margaret Watt, they're from Harvey, of course, and Carmichael, James Carmichael, was an Irish shoemaker, according to her. I haven't been able to actually establish that he was Irish. He probably was Scottish, but according to the donor, he was an Irish shoemaker. And also in the 1881 census, he is listed as coming from England. So donors sometimes, they get the family history second to third hand, but it's always good to do your research. And Katie was born in 1894, of course, in Harvey. And this is a pair of boots that was actually made by James. They're quite well worn because they date a long time ago. And we have a picture on the screen. I've actually got the boots here with me. Very well worn. Leather's seen better days, but and if you picked up the bottom of the boot, you can see the nails that would have been tacked on to the soles. Actually, they're all been patched. Probably have worn until they couldn't be worn anymore. So now the next collection from the Harvey area comes from the Messer family, from Geneva Messer, who I actually had the privilege of working with at King's Landing. She was born 1930, died in 2013. And this is a table that she donated to King's Landing. And if you come visit us at King's Landing, go up to the Queen cabin, the Irish cabin. You'll find this table there as part of the Irish Queen family's furniture. I couldn't bring it with me tonight, sorry, it couldn't fit in my Kia, but I figured it was better left in its own setting. And Geneva said that, and she donated 3 items to King's Landing, and they came from her husband Lawrence Messer's family. He was born 1931, died in 2001, and his family, of course, immigrated to Harvey. And they descended from William Messer, which I know she had a binder of their family history, and Margaret Bell, again the Bell family. Okay, Helen Craig. Now here we have the Craig family, and Mr. Craig. And in 1837, he came a little later than the first wave of immigration. Henry Craig came to this area with his new bride and his bachelor brother James, and they came. Well, I guess they came under Cornelius, so they came as the first group. And they took up the land grants, of course, in Harvey. And they had what was called a Tier 1 land grant, which is now along Route 3. And he also, James, his brother, received another tier of land further back in what's called the second tier. Henry built his home in the middle of a field where his family lived until they moved to another home in 1875. And the second home is, according to our records, is still standing in Harvey. Maybe somebody knows different, but yeah. And in 1841, Thomas Craig and his wife, who would be the parents of Henry and James, sold all the possessions and moved to New Brunswick to live in Harvey with Henry. Thomas was a weaver and was 70 years old in 1841. And also later on, 1843, Thomas Jr. and William, also brothers, immigrated to New Brunswick, and they settled in Red Rock, which is near Stanley, so they didn't settle in this area. So what I have from the Craig family was the actual tool that Henry used to build his house, which is a T-square pictured in the slide. Doesn't have markings like most T-squares do that I've seen in our collection, but maybe it's because it was custom made by Henry. So the family story is that this is the actual tool he used to build his first house. So he's quite an accomplished carpenter. T-square there. So, and it said that he walked into Stanley. And this is Henry Craig in what's called a custodist, which is a later photographic process. Not sure if I brought him or not. I think he's at the archives. Now, another family represented at King's Landing in our collection is the Greed family. And the Greed family. Emma, who was a donor, and this was donated to King's Landing in 2007, was the daughter of Hayes and Clifton Dykeman, 1864-1940, and Jane Ewan Halford, 1864 to 1940, of Lower Jinsade and Acton. Now, that's not a Harvey connection, but Melvin and Emma, who Melvin was her husband, farmed the homestead of his father, William, and great-grandfather, William Greed. So Emma was a Dykeman, not from the area, but her husband was a Greed from this area. And the family, this farm is now, I guess, referred to as a fourth-generation farm that was started in 1844. And we actually have this quilt that was made by Emma Florence Dykeman, who lived from 1890 to 1989, married in 1813 to Charles Melvin Greed. And not going to lay it out, but people are welcome to come up afterwards and actually take a look at it. Beautiful Irish chain, and it still maintains a lot of its nice colors. So, and it's a summer quilt because it's not very thick. Winter quilts are usually the tacked ones with wool. This would be a summer quilt because it's not designed for mostly for warmth. It's designed to look nice to be on the bed. Here. Now, next family we represent at King's Landing is the Little family. Now, this is the donor, Roy Little, and we got these boots in 2005. They belong to Edith Messer, who lived from 1896 to 1990, and she married Roy Swan in 1922. They lived in Macadam, where she was a clerk in Pat Eel's store. I assume people in Macadam know who Pat Eel's store is. And Edith was the daughter of, again, William Messer and Isabel Torrance, and they lived in Tweedside. They married on June 12, 1895. And these boots are probably, by the date and style, owned by Isabel Torrance Messer. And the manufacturer is best we can make out by the label Havens of Bliss. And they were donated to King's Landing by their neighbor, Roy Little. So we have these lovely boots. A bit more stylish than the Carmichael boots. Nice pointed toes, lace up. They're actually quite gorgeous. They probably were worn for food because they don't look very practical for going around the farm and they're not very warm. Especially if you have nice narrow feet. So there is the boots that came from the Messer family. So those are just a few of our collections. So kind of reaching my conclusion. And so I just want to explain that Harvey is part of our interpretation at King's Landing. Because King's Landing is evolving past the stories told by the families that were displaced because of the Mattaquack Dam. And the way we use our collections at King's Landing, for example, the Messer boots or the Carmichael boots, is we would put them in homes of people that would have worn that style of boot or worn the work boots. We would use the daguerreotypes to place in somebody's parlor to make it look like it's a family heirloom. We also do exhibits. So if we were going to do an exhibit, we could focus primarily on a particular family, like the Messers or the Littles, Carmichaels, Wilsons, and feature their whole collection and tell the whole family story. We're not collecting as we did previously. We're kind of slowing down a bit because mostly because of space. We're only so big. But we always put up an open invitation to the community, Harvey rural community, to approach us, to share some of their stories with us and possibly their artifacts. So that's an open invitation. As you can see earlier, our collections mandate and policy is kind of broad. But, and we collect up to the year 1939, right before the Second World War. And we're going into our 50th anniversary next year. We're reaching out to the community to hear stories from people that work at King's Landing, that have artifacts part of our collection, that knew the communities at the time that we were established, that took part in our activities. We had an open invitation for people to approach us with their stories or to be interviewed, audio interviews. So if you know somebody that has a good story to tell about King's Landing going into our 50th next year, reach out through our webpage. There's a contact there. So yeah, so that brings me to the end of my presentation. And questions, of course. Silence.
Are you still doing the kids program there?
Visiting cousins?
Yeah.
We plan to bring it back next year. Yeah. If you've been to King's Landing recently, seen the lovely slip house that we moved. We moved the slip house from the service area where nobody could see it into the village itself. It's set up sort of in back of the Hagerman house. We've restored it. We've repainted it. We've redone the inside completely to make it accessible for children going forward. Children with mobility, disabilities. It's all wheelchair accessible now. There's caregivers rooms for those that require caregivers. So the whole plan was to sort of integrate this program more into the community instead of, see the children walk out of the village and never see them again till the next day. So our plans are to bring it back next year, yes. But stay tuned.
So the buildings that were salvaged, okay, were they in, non-livable situation? Were they, partially demolished and bringing them back together?
Most of them, we had this architectural historian, John Stevens, before the dam was even built, go up and down the river and identify good buildings to salvage. Most of them were in really good shape. They just had to be sold to the community or to the government because they were expropriated, because they're going to lose they basically were going to be underwater. So they were bought by the government and moved to a large salvage field. And of course, these were the houses as is in the 60s. So they had modern bathrooms, they had electricity. They were all set up for 1960s living in rural New Brunswick. So we then went through and architects made the decision for the most part to identify which ones were the most salvageable. And the ones that could represent the 19th century the best. Some were so many additions and add-ons that you really couldn't see the bare bones of the 19th century house. So yeah, for the most part, and if they weren't in the best of shape, a lot of their architectural features were used to reconstruct the other homes. If they had a nice fireplace around and the home needed a nice fireplace around, because of course they modernized, they might salvage it from another property or another building.
Do you ever have any carpenters go in and do the exact work that they've never been used for? Replicate furniture and that type of thing?
We do have carpenters that interpret carpentry at King's Landing. They're always building furniture and anything we need in the village. We have two carpenters, plus we have the sash and door factory, which makes factory produced window sashes, and door frames, and things like that. Our carpenters, they make they make furniture, they make boxes, they make trunks, whatever they approach us with ideas of what they want to make, and then we kind of match it against what we need to have made.
And so are these items that are for sale, like somebody going in visiting, you know, type of thing?
Yes, yep, most of what they make, if they're not reproductions that we need, say, in the village, are sold at our Thanksgiving auction on Saturday of Thanksgiving weekend. And we just open it to the public, come in and bid on these objects, take them away, and yeah. The goal is to produce something that can either be used at King's Landing or sold to the public.
No, there was a place near where we used to live, Sherbrooke Village.
Yes, yeah.
And they did that, and they would mostly work on renovating or restoring the village itself. But then somebody could come in and have like a door read or like a.
Oh, yes, you mean like people in like the community could ask them to make something. We don't usually do that the custom jobs like that for people. Certainly a lot of our employees are very talented carpenters to start with. Some of them have their own business. One of them is from this area actually. So
Jackson.
yes, yeah. So they of course have their own side business, but when it comes to King's Landing, it's the interpreters themselves plus the needs of King's Landing that have to mesh together and decide what the project's going to be.
Do we have any questions from the Zoomers? No.
Quiet.
Any more questions here for Evelyn?
I don't have a question, but that quilt was made by my grandmother's sister.
Ah,
And there were 3 sisters married 3 brothers.
Oh my goodness. Really? So your grandmother was
Ella Dykeman.
okay.
It was Emma and Ella. And so they married, those 2 sisters married 2 brothers. Greaves.
Wow. And this one was actually made by Ella?
No, this was made by Emma.
Emma, yeah. So it was her sister.
And my grandmother was Ella, her
Ella.
sister.
Wow.
And she was married to Wilma Greaves,
Okay.
who was also a brother to Melvin Greaves.
Wow.
Okay?
So that's
It was very confusing for family get-togethers.
yeah. Especially when the father has the same name as the son and the grandson. Families were known for that. I don't know why, but I guess they honor them. But and of course, the people in communities had nicknames instead of like if father was William and son was Williams, they probably weren't going by.
I remember as a little girl going to Aunt Emma's house or my grandmother's house or there was another sister. But anyway, they would have quiltings.
Oh yes, yeah.
I can remember going under the quilt and playing.
Yeah.
So I wasn't old enough to quilt.
I did the same. It's a nice tent. I used to do the same thing. Yes, yeah. Crawl underneath it. Wow. That is a beautiful quilt, and it's surprising that the colors are still as bright as they are. And yeah, and when it comes to things like historic quilts, clothing, things like that, we don't use them in the village. We use them as patterns to reproduce them. So if they wanted to do a double Irish chain,
the Irish chain is what it is. Yeah.
that's what it was called by the donor, yeah, or the person that was what we call cataloging it and do something with quilts. They called it the Irish double chain. So, yeah, you can just feel a little batting through here too. It gets washed in the bowl all kind of. I found that out the hard way. That's great.
And then
Okay.
the other side of the family is the Littles. So.
Oh my. I've worked at King's Landing with a lot of Littles, Messers, McNally's, yes. Yeah, and McNally's is agents all over. Is that the Kingsclear side or the Keswick side? It's a little further up, I think. Yeah, wow. There was
McNally Sugar Bush.
yes, heard of that, yeah. Yeah, McNally's definitely, I think we've got a few things. McNally's and Yeah, and there was one person I found, he was supposed to have been a blacksmith in the Harvey area, and his last name was Irish, it was a mix. Oh, I didn't write it down, but I could not find any information on him, so my goal is to get up here sometime to see if somehow he exists in here, because we have a piece of iron, I think it's a crane in the crane cabinet that he actually made. So I just can't find anything about him, so, yeah. I need community stories to make him up.
Well, if there's no more questions, we thank you so much, Evelyn, for coming and talking to us.